各位女士、各位先生，欢迎大家来参加我们罗家伦国际汉学讲座今年的第2场系列演讲。那么非常荣幸请到爱尔兰国立大学亚洲研究中心的主任Kia-Luen Paramore 教授。那他来我们这里的系列演讲呢，讲的这个题目是在东亚政治思想中的历史的这个政治关于这个全球化历史方法跟这个儒家历史的这个问题。那我们今天也非常荣幸请到政治系的叶浩教授来担任这一场的这个主持人。那我底下就把时间交给叶教授，我们就开始这一场的演讲。
Okay. I'm Anthony Ye, teaching at the Department of Political Science. And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to NCCU Chia-Luen International Sinology Lecture. This year, our distinguished guest is Professor Kia-Luen Paramore, originally from Australia. Prof. Paramore is now based in National University of Ireland as a professor of Asian Studies at University College Cork. He's well known for his research on Japanese intellectual history and East Asian Confucianism. And today, he's here to talk about the politics of history in East Asian political thought. Yes, politics is intertwined with the way people understand history and the way people write about history, or historiography, so to speak. Yet, historiography in East Asian political thought is a sphere of inquiry until today understudied. So he's here. And as discourses of globalization are everywhere, the way people write about history tends to take nationalist approach, and books are often written with a particular nation at the center, as if history goes around those nations, and those nations as history as their stage. But Professor Paramore has a different story to tell. And by way of focusing on Confucianism in East Asia, he will reveal the fact that the way we periodize history is very political, modern, and somehow Western-centric as well, or even Eurocentric, and hence colonial in character. So I can't wait for his lecture, and I can't wait to learn from him. Let's welcome Professor Paramore.
Thank you very much, Professor Ye, for that very kind introduction. I'm a bit surprised how much you know about what I'm going to say. It sounds like you have guessed the entire lecture, so I feel like I don't even need to talk. But thank you very much for the introduction, and indeed, that is exactly what I want to talk about in the coming 4 days. So before I begin, I would like to thank Professor Lin for inviting me, thank the university, Zhengda for this opportunity, and also thank Professor Watanabe Hiroshi from, originally from the University of Tokyo, who also played a role in making this possible. So over the next 4 days, I'll present, I might just move this around actually, seeing I have to stay close to the microphone. I'm one of these people who walks a lot usually, so this will be very hard for me to stay in one place for 2 hours, because usually I walk around, but now I'll have to stay close to the microphone. So over the next 4 days, today, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, I will present 4 talks themed on the global history of Confucianism. In the first of the 2 talks, today and tomorrow, I intend to focus on the framing and delivery of the Cambridge History of Confucianism, a large project including scholars from around the world working to deliver a single-volume history of Confucianism. The key to this project is to present Confucianism as history. That is, through the discipline of history as it currently stands. Not through philosophy or other academic paradigms, not theory, history, the real past. Now, the project is global in that the scholars writing it and the readership are global, but also because the approach engages new paradigms in history writing, sometimes associated with or contrasted against so-called global history. It is also global because, taking a historical approach, we do not see Confucianism as Chinese or Japanese or indeed belonging to any other modern nation state. How could it, given that most of its history was pre-modern, before nation states existed? As per the abstracts for the talk today, I will talk about methods in history and global history writing. That's what I'll do today, look at methods, before tomorrow moving on to look at how these are concretely applied in writing a global history of Confucianism. So today is method, tomorrow is application to Confucianism. And tomorrow I will actually present you some of the chapters from the Cambridge History of Confucianism, written by other people, to illustrate that approach. Now, the last 2 days, Thursday and Friday, will also use the lens of global history to approach an issue of intellectual history, but we will move our focus from the Cambridge History of Confucianism to the Cambridge History of Democracy, where I will present a chapter I am writing on Japan for that volume. In that essay, I also deal with Confucian history, but in the context of Japan and the global history of the concept of democracy. So those are the 4 sessions we have. So now today, in today's session, session 1 on Tuesday, today's talk will frame our approach to looking at the Cambridge History of Confucianism. I will begin by talking about how Confucianism and history interact in general, but also how the Cambridge history as a genre of historical writing influences our approach to Confucianism, and how it compels us to use certain historical approaches. So a lot of these choices are not really my choices. They're sort of, the press indicates ways of doing things. I'll then go through a range of historical approaches which have traditionally been problematic in writing the history of Confucianism, and introduce alternative approaches, better approaches, I would say, from more modern global historical methods. So, yeah, and then I'll go through, and then these are basically the areas, what you see on the PowerPoint here, these are the areas that I'll look at. These are the areas of historical methodology that I'll look at. So, for instance, as Professor Ye mentioned, critique of national history, but not just critique. So what do we do instead of national history? Because we now have other approaches to use, and I'll talk about how we can use those approaches in relation to Confucianism. So let's begin now with section 1 there, History, Confucianism and the Cambridge History Genre. So some introductory comments. Confucianism is an axial concept in modern conceptions of political, economic and social history globally. From Karl Marx's conception of modes of production, to Max Weber's understanding of politics, to the underlying ideas of economic development and liberty found in Adam Smith and John Stuart Mills. Confucianism was mentioned in all those works and resonates as a marker of a particular form of the past, central in how we define the modern present. The history of Confucianism, therefore, is central to any understanding of modern history itself. Conversely, history is also central to any understanding of Confucianism. Confucian worldviews are marked by their historicity. Where God and heaven stand in other traditions, in Confucianism stands a sacralized past, its way being almost always clearly identified as the way of the ancient sage kings. Perfection is marked temporally, in time, by a certain moment and place in the past. History in Confucianism could thereby be seen as the methodology for uncovering the perfect. The prayers and faith of other traditions are replaced or at least augmented by learning and knowledge. History and Confucianism are thus intimately linked. The Cambridge History of Confucianism foregrounds that link, overtly privileging an historical analysis of Confucianism. Like many other philosophical and religious traditions, Confucianism is often studied from a primarily doctrinal standpoint, through texts, with emphasis on interpreting the meaning, outlook, or motivation in the tradition. The Sollen for Kant, what the tradition aspires to be. History rather focuses on the Sein, what a tradition has actually been. When examining Confucianism, as when examining Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, liberalism, Marxism, the historian has an advantage over the philosopher or philologist because the historian can go beyond what the tradition says it is. Because these traditions, notably including Confucianism, because they have played a central role in political and social organisation in a range of societies, we are equipped through history to analyse those traditions' real social manifestations. We have the sources available to look at what it actually is in social practice. Such an approach obviously represents a choice to privilege political, sociological, and anthropological method over those of philosophy, religion, or traditional philology. This is the choice that most historians make regardless of their object of study. History over the past 100 years has become an increasingly socially integrated discipline, and over the past half-century, anthropology has undoubtedly eclipsed philology as the dominant methodology and methodological influence in the history discipline. And I'll come back to the importance of anthropology later, again and again and again. So the project I'm going to concentrate upon in today and tomorrow's talks is the Cambridge History of Confucianism, which I have the privilege of editing. Cambridge Histories, a prestigious but also very particular genre in the discipline of history, have a history and form of their own, built on over a century of modern historical scholarly tradition. As you see here, the first volumes produced in 1902. That tradition has influenced history writing, and history writing today is often defined in relation to it. Sometimes against it, but nevertheless with it in mind. Delivering Confucianism through the framework of a Cambridge history thus also has a particular effect. So I'm going to take a moment to look at the Cambridge history genre and its own history. So a bit of a tangent talking about the Cambridge history, but I think interesting. The first Cambridge history, the Cambridge modern history, was conceived by Lord Acton. Lord Acton, born in 1834, died in 1902, was an English Catholic noble, politically and intellectually active through the mid-19th century, and appointed Regius Professor of Modern History at Cambridge towards the end of his life in 1895. These Regius Professors are appointed by the sovereign. They're appointed by the Queen or the King. They still exist, by the way, interestingly. So you probably, maybe you haven't heard of Lord Acton, but I bet you've heard of some of his famous quotes, which I don't have here. For instance, one famous quote is, "Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." That's a Lord Acton, right? His idea of the Cambridge modern history was to create a kind of universal history in some ways similar to earlier European works such as George Weber's Allgemeine Weltgeschichte of 1857, but instead of authored by one author, authored by a range of individual experts from different countries, each writing on their specialist area in an effort to create together a universal history. Intriguingly, this act of writing a book together with other international experts was criticised in his own time as creating an industrial-like division of labour, and thereby, quote, turning the university into a factory. This is 1895 when he was criticised on this. He defended this approach as leading to universal history. But what did he mean by universal history? Quote, by universal history, I understand that which is distinct from the combined histories of all countries, which is not a rope of sand, but a continuous development, and is not a burden on the memory, but an illumination of the soul. It moves in a succession to which the nations are subsidiary. Their story would be told not for their own sake, but in reference and subordination to a higher series, according to the time and the degree in which they contribute to the common fortunes of mankind. Excuse the sexist language, but it is 1898 at this stage. The universal history, and particularly the division of labour manner of its planned production by many hands, also interacted with diversity of opinion or analysis for this liberal noble. Quote, historians in our self-critical age are aware that there will not be general agreement with their conclusions, nor even with some of the premises which they regard as self-evident. They must be content to set out their own thought without reserve and to respect the differences which they cannot eradicate. End quote. Of course, written more than 130 years ago, in a time when professional scholars were often aristocrats and would act accordingly, and he was an aristocrat, there is only so much that can be applied to our own times. This is particularly the case, seeing that many of the most famous Cambridge histories that have appeared over the last 50 years are actually national volumes. Many of you may be aware of the Cambridge History of China, for instance, which I think took more than half a century to complete and was only recently completed. Even in these, what's the next slide I've got there? Yeah, even in these national volumes, however, an approach rooted in the history of discipline and attempting to combine a number of different specialisms to make something larger is a feature of this genre. Today I want to talk about what the history discipline and how historical method affects a Cambridge history about Confucianism. And to do so, I want to think about how history has changed over the last couple of decades. So how the way we do history has changed. And one way to begin talking about that, I'd like to use a concrete example, which also comes from the Cambridge history tradition, which you see here, which is the Cambridge History of Japan. In addition to editing this Cambridge History of Confucianism, I also wrote the chapter on political history for the new Cambridge History of Japan, second volume, that one down there. And this has only just come out. So the Cambridge History of Japan is a particularly useful example for looking at change through history, because two versions of the Cambridge History of Japan have been produced. One, which was begun in 1969 and finished in 1999, and the other, called the New Cambridge History of Japan, which was just published a couple of months ago. This renewal of a Cambridge history is based on the example of the original Cambridge Modern History. The Cambridge Modern History, planned by Lord Acton, appeared between 1902 and 1912, but this was replaced by a new Cambridge Modern History which appeared between 1957 and 1974, as you see here. The original Cambridge History of Japan was a project first proposed in 1969, begun in 1976, when I was 4 years old, and published between 1988 and 1999. So I managed to finish university before they'd finished the job. So the new Cambridge History of Japan, now being published, is thus a second version, which overtly looks to take into account changes in the history field that have occurred in the intervening 30 to 50 years. So in explaining the genre, I'd like to read to you from the preface to the new Cambridge History of Japan, which was written by Laura Hine. Actually, just before I read you this quote from Laura Hine, these are actually from the archives of Cambridge University Press, and my dear colleague, Dr. Han Song Shung, who was at Harvard, is now at Durham University. He went into the archives of Cambridge University Press and found this. And you can see that back in the 1970s, when they were planning to write the history of the 19th century in Japan, their key concepts were modernization and imperialism. You know, in the 1970s, it was all about modernization and when do you become an empire? Yes, you've grown up now. Great, we're an empire, right? Whereas, of course, that approach has changed. So I'll read to you from Laura Hines' introduction to this, to the preface to the new Cambridge History of Japan. Quote, "The Cambridge History series forms a distinctive genre, one whose essays differ from the monograph chapter, journal article, or encyclopedia entry. We have endeavoured to use that genre to bring 73 essays of contemporary scholarship on pre-modern, early modern, and modern Japanese history to a new generation. The Cambridge histories are intended to be accessible to diverse but specific audiences. That is to provide a crash course for colleagues who specialise on other parts of the world, a single location for undergraduate and graduate students who are getting a handle on the diversity of the past, and a topography for the general educated reader with an interest in Japan. An underlying assumption is that we write for readers across the globe. Another convention of this genre is to put political history at the centre of the narrative, even though political, narrowly defined, does not usefully capture the contours of public life for many pre-modern and early modern societies. Nor does it help us see people who were poorly represented by their political leaders. We deal with these limitations here by expanding our definition of political history to encompass everything that has to do with public, civic, and state activities. This includes categories such as gender, which we see as profoundly political in this sense. Like all Cambridge histories, however, the selection leans towards political, economic, and social topics, here including environmental and urban history. Since the Cambridge History's inception over a century ago, the genre has celebrated narrative over accumulation of facts, encourages participants to synthesise with gusto, and urged them to choose a point of view that has obvious relevance in the contemporary world. The multiplicity of authors also implies internal diversity. Readers can expect that any given volume represents a range of concerns and approaches, for the past holds many different lessons for the present." So that's Laura Hine, the main editor of this new Cambridge History of Japan, who is herself an important modern social historian of Japan. So the editors then go on in this preface to talk about changes in the way of seeing history since relatively recent time. And you see that some of them have already been highlighted in the preface comments. Gender, urban history, environmental history. Others include underclass history, so history of lower caste groups. So in Japan you have this group called Hisabetsu Burakumin, right, which is sometimes likened to untouchable caste people in India. So histories of these people, the role of indigenous people, borderland history. These are also mentioned later in this introduction. So for the volume I'm editing, the Cambridge History of Confucianism, these elements of the history discipline that were not dominant in the 1970s or 80s, but are dominant now, these changes are even more striking in a history of Confucianism. And that is because, although the new Cambridge History of Japan may be new, it is also still based on a nation-state category. Since the latter 20th century, there has been a major critique of nation-centred history. And of course, that is especially relevant to a volume on Confucianism, which on the one hand covers areas and cultures which now and in the past have always been stretched across a number of different states, a number of different countries and states. And yet it's also a tradition which is linked with specific essentializations of some modern national cultures. Confucian values this term, right? To define Chinese or Korean or Dainippon Teikoku, the great Japanese empire, right? Which it was also used to define their identity, their self-imaginations and their political constructions. So the issue of national history is actually particularly problematic for Confucianism. In the talk today, or at least in the first part of it, inspired by the approach of the new Cambridge History of Japan editors, I'll begin by outlining a number of changes in the way we approach history which have developed since the latter 20th century relevant to the Cambridge History of Confucianism project. That is, relevant to writing a global history of Confucianism. Then in the second part of this talk, most of which will be delivered tomorrow, so then tomorrow I'll talk about a number of chapters, a large number of chapters in the Cambridge History of Confucianism, demonstrating how these approaches, these historical methodologies, are realised in those chapters and across the volume. By the way, happily, the authors don't mention the methodologies. They just write the history, right? But we can see the effect if we analyse those chapters. So these are the sort of areas we're looking at. So we've done number one now. We've had our introductory comments and we've looked at the Cambridge history genre. And we'll now move on to critiques of national history, critiques of Eurocentrism, already mentioned by Professor Ye. So number two will be critiques and alternatives to Eurocentrism. Number three, critiques and alternatives to elite history. And lastly, we'll talk a little about periods and periodization. So Professor Ye somehow knew exactly what we were going to do today. I don't know how, but that's indeed what we're going to do. So let's begin with national history. National history has been critiqued from a number of angles with a range of global, local and regional alternatives offered up at different times in different places over the past 50 years or so. One of the earliest and most enduring critiques of national history is of its inherent ahistoricity, ahistoric. It doesn't have a history. It pretends that there is no history. It pretends that it's essentialist, basically. Because nations are, after all, predominantly modern phenomenon. So how can we possibly do history of the pre-modern using categories that only date from the modern period? Longue durée historians and pre-modern historians in general have therefore tended to see a problem inherent in national history, that it projects back onto pre-modern history an array of characteristics associated with modern nations that simply do not apply in most pre-modern polities. A shared, mutually intelligible, vernacular spoken language. Nations are supposed to have this, right? Common ethnicity. Uniform political structures at the local level. State ability to regulate and tax most economic activity. Contiguous control over the entire territory. Of course, no pre-modern state could sustain most of these. In more recent global history, the so-called spatial turn underpins another critique of national history, that the spatial realities of the past and the economic and cultural effects of that spatial reality simply do not match and do not naturally align with national categories. So if you think about in the medieval period already, right? In the medieval period, trade in the South China Seas. The main historical and economic and political influences on trade in the South China, through the South China Seas and through Indonesia and out into the Indian Ocean, these were not Chinese empires or any other empires. Right? It's better to look at the sea itself. It's better to look at that ocean and look at those trade networks themselves. Looking at states is not a good way to understand that very, very important phenomenon, just as one example. Right? Even the United States of America, right? Also to think about territory. In the early 1800s, the United States of America most of what is now the United States of America was not the United States of America. So to understand, for instance, what is now the western seaboard of North America, to understand its history in the early 1800s, which was dominated by things like whaling and sealing. Thinking about the United States of America as a political construct is not very useful to think about it, because the United States of America as a political construct didn't control those areas. Right? So this is sort of what we're talking about. And of course, in East Asia, it's the same. Think about the use of the word Vietnam, and think about the reality of where states were. I mean, most of what is now Vietnam was only conquered by those states very, very recently. So using these national terms and narrating history in those terms is seen as nonsensical for spatial history. So what is the alternative? Let's not just critique, let's say what is the positive alternative? And there are a whole range of positive alternatives. One clear alternative coming from a spatial approach is to replace modern national categories with more enduring categories. For instance, emanating from geography. We now have histories of the Indian Ocean. So I think you see some of these. Yeah, you see some of these histories of the Indian Ocean, histories of the Eurasian continent. For China, if one uses the Central Plain, for instance, rather than China, one must acknowledge the different ethnic groups, languages, and religious and thought systems which has moved across this area at different times in history. Another alternative provided by spatial history is to base history on practices shared across particular areas. One famous example, there's an example here, is the horse, the use of horses, for instance, right? Which provides us with an alternative history of the Eurasian, especially Central Asian area. Another alternative is networks. So you could think of the Republic of Letters in late medieval Europe. You could think of the monastic networks of Buddhism. That could be another frame for writing history. Or the Christian networks, again, across early medieval Eurasia. These are all alternative frames. Probably the most famous example of this later type of history writing applied to a tradition somewhat similar to Confucianism is Sheldon Pollock's idea of a Sanskrit or Brahmic cultural cosmopolis, linking polities from Central and South Asia through islands Southeast Asia in his 2006 book, The Language of the Gods in the World of Men, the big book on the PowerPoint here. And that then inspired the book to the right of it, Islam Translated by Ronit Ritchie, which looks actually at to some extent the same sort of areas of Southeast Asia, but showing where that Sanskrit Brahmic-based culture is replaced then by an Arabic language, Islamic culture. But in both cases, the key term used is cosmopolis, meaning there are many different polities sharing this tradition, but there is no imperial center. There is no dominant culture. Whereas when we talk about empires, there is the empire and the peripheries. When we talk about civilization, we think of a center and then peripheries. Whereas the idea of a cosmopolis is just various sort of places linked through a tradition. And this is this big contribution, really, that Sheldon Pollock and later Ronit Ritchie made to our understanding of how multipolar intellectual traditions can function. Now, there are obvious ramifications here and alternatives offered to the common practice of framing Confucianism as imperial history or as a civilization. So this opens up other ways of framing Confucianism. We could frame, and I do frame, in my own work, not in the volume, but in my own personal work, I do frame Confucianism in terms of the idea of cosmopolis, because it offers more opportunities than, say, empire or civilization. So returning to our critique of national history, the problem most often identified alongside and arising out of its aforementioned ahistoricity, its lack of chronology, is of course cultural essentialism. And I'm sure everyone in this room was warned against cultural essentialism, even as undergraduates. And many of us, we're from Taiwan or Australia, we're from colonial backgrounds, so cultural essentialism is sort of obvious to us. It's interesting being in Ireland, the students, they immediately get these things, because whereas in Holland, the students did not so much get these things, which is an interesting difference. So we all sort of understand the idea of cultural essentialism. And yet, cultural essentialism, I think, is often more present in intellectual histories of East Asia than it might seem. And that presence can be quite subtle. Let me use an example of a historian who undoubtedly made major contributions to this field, William Theodore de Barry, and you see some of his books on the right there. Now, no one would suggest that de Barry was not a serious historian who used close reading of sources and a range of historical methods in his research. Most of the various studies he did, particularly writings on particular texts and thinkers, were backed up by a historical knowledge of the times he was writing about. His editing of major works in English, notably the sources of Chinese tradition that you see at the bottom right-hand side there, which was, I think, 3 or 4 volumes, and there's a matching sources of Japanese tradition, source of Korean tradition, source of Vietnamese tradition. This series, which was a series of source translations, was and is actually a major contribution to global understandings of East Asian history. However, if one looks at his final analysis or his conclusion in works like, for instance, his commentary and translation of Huang Zongxi's work, there is an inclination to identify the development of values associated either with Chinese or East Asian civilization. In other words, although he interprets Huang Zongxi's work in relation to its own time, he does understand the late Ming historical context of Huang Zongxi's work, but he doesn't analyse its impact focusing on change through time, but rather takes the content of the work as indicating a particular spirit of the civilization, which, though all established in a particular time, then becomes an essentialised representative of that culture from that time onwards. De Barry's attempt to create an image of East Asian values within a civilizational paradigm demarcated primarily by Confucianism was, of course, a reflection of and a reaction to problems in his own time and in his own country. Almost his entire career was spent at Columbia University in New York, and his early and mid-career occurred during the Vietnam War, during the American Vietnam War. His attachment to creating a narrative of East Asian or Chinese civilization was surely a reaction to a core imperialist element in mid-20th century elite US academia. And it's still there, actually, in elite US academia, which is the concept of Western civilization. And you see a sort of representative book from his time, from de Barry's time, which every American university student would learn. This is our Western civilization, and we learn about this. And he, of course, would have understood the political implications of that. This approach to history, this Western civilizational approach to history, in his own day, during the Vietnam War, as much as today, used by the likes of Niall Ferguson, was intimately interlinked with the construction of US nationalist and imperialist identities, employed to justify US geopolitics and the neo-imperialism of the West. So from our position now in 2024, we can both sympathise with and perhaps appreciate de Barry's laudable aim of trying to relativise or push back against the idea of Western civilization. But at the same time, we can see that methodologically it mirrors the idea of Western civilization and falls into the same traps. De Barry attempted to oppose the Western civilization or sort of nationalist or imperialist construction of history and culturally essentially valued, ultimately through a methodology which in many ways perhaps imitated it. Maybe I'm being too severe there, but perhaps. So what was the problem with that approach? Let's step back from the politics and think, what was the problem in that approach methodologically? In short, it was that it emphasised points of convergence amongst different peoples and places over differences. I'm not saying we shouldn't look at convergences, we should, but also differences. So to do that, to do what it did by concentrating on convergence and ignoring differences, it concentrated on elite culture and writing. If you look at the content of those sources of tradition, they're primarily elite writings. So the method tended to marginalise or even exclude a range of historical voices and actors, from women to the illiterate. And of course, in pre-modern societies, the illiterate is nearly everybody. Right? So, and also it excludes a whole range of caste and ethnic groups in different societies. And my point here in seeing this as a negative, by the way, is not a political point. I'm not saying it's a problem to exclude women from history because I love women, right? It's a problem empirically because the facts are half the people there were women, right? That's the fact. So therefore, if you don't look at it, it's not the truth, right? So this is, for me, not about politics or values. It's about, it's quite, I'm being quite positivistic and old-fashioned here, you know, it's about truth. So if you exclude them, then your history is simply no longer narrating the reality of the past. And the historical picture presented, when you exclude all these people, it must be false. So another aspect of framing in nations, and particularly in civilizations, which exacerbates the above problems, is the inherently hierarchical nature of civilization, including ideas of centre and periphery, which we will come back to. So again, to some more alternatives to these problems. As mentioned, this kind of problem, as we see it in the example of de Berry, is not about ahistoricity in the reading of the sources. When he reads the sources, he places them in the historical context. It's about how he frames, or how we frame, the analysis of those sources. So in addition to the cosmopolis approach of Pollock and Ritchie noted above, other examples I'd give of different kinds of framing include dynastic history, and I give as an example here the book by Jeroen Dijndam, which is influenced by Christopher Bailey's work. Another way to frame as an alternative to a civilizational discourse is Sanjay Subrahmanyan's emphasis on conjuncture. And both these examples may look like they share something in common with civilizational history, in that they frame particular regions connected politically and economically. But the difference is that they do not then present the analysis in a closed format to reflect back upon or essentialize the cultures under consideration. Rather, notably in conjuncture, in this approach called conjuncture that Subrahmanyan uses, they demand that any conclusions from a study of one region be linked into considerations of others. So let's now move on to the second point of critique and the alternatives to it. And this is a critique to what, here I've written on the PowerPoint, centrism. I don't think centrism is actually a word in English. I think I just made it up for this PowerPoint. I'm of course thinking of Eurocentrism, right? When you live in Europe, Eurocentrism is horrible, right? And it's everywhere. So Eurocentrism, but of course, I'm thinking of how Eurocentrism works. And Sinocentrism, any other kind of centrism works the same way. So I think rather than focusing on the Euro part of Eurocentrism, I want to focus on the operation, how this way of thinking works, this centrism. So this brings us to the second point of critique, vital for reframing studies of Confucianism in a global context, centrism. And the critique is focused, of course, usually on the idea of Eurocentrism. Eurocentrism, I think is the way to pronounce it, centrism. Eurocentrism. And Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe is, of course, the sort of classic reference in relation to this. But actually, this outlook has been well established now for many decades and is particularly strong in South and Southeast Asia, in Australasia, and in North and South America. All societies, of course, where the current states emerged from totally colonized societies, right? All these places share that sort of background. The critique of Eurocentrism in history is, of course, that it links teleological movements towards modernity, sort of modern development, with modes of human development portrayed as originating in Europe, measuring history in other societies with a Eurocentric yardstick. It sees modernity as having one cultural origin. Underlying this approach, however, is also the idea that innovations spread outwards from a centre to the periphery. The parallels with the theoretical imagination of empire and civilization are clear, with the related hierarchical positions. A Eurocentric view of history thus both narrates a movement of innovation outwards through imperial networks from a metropole centre to the peripheries/colonies, and also implies a justification of empire as civilizing mission, even when that civilizing mission is secularized in the classic modernization theory, made dominant in the late 20th century and still very influential today. The core problem is that it thereby sees cultural movement and political and scientific influence as a one-way movement, from centre to periphery outwards, and not in any other direction. Other forms of centrism, of course, resemble Eurocentrism in the way they work. Sinocentrism, for instance, although not dominating history writing across the world, works on similar paradigms in that it assumes a centre with innovative influence stretching outwards. And again, it's hierarchical, with centre and periphery being perceived in parallel with advanced and backward. Just to clarify, I am not talking here about so-called sinocentric views within Confucianism, within Confucian writing. I'm not talking about the allegation that Confucian texts are sinocentric. I'm talking about the way writers of modern history narrate the past, right? So if we think of things like trade in the South China Sea that we mentioned earlier, for instance. Returning to Eurocentrism, I'll talk about alternatives in a moment. But before mentioning alternatives, I'd also like to address how recent historians, including intellectual historians, have used historical research, the historical sources, to challenge the idea of centrism through historical evidence. One example is the work of Duncan Bell, and this is the book here directly behind me, a professor of political theory at Cambridge in the Quentin Skinner School. He might have been a student of Quentin Skinner, but I'm not sure. He was he? Okay. Oh, there. Thank Professor. Yeah, no, it's good. I thought he was, but I wasn't sure. Thank you. And Duncan Bell has significantly rewritten the history of 19th century liberalism, what is often called British liberalism, showing the extent to which key ideas and practices in the tradition of liberal political thought emerged not from the metropole, then London, but rather from thinkers and innovative administrative and government practices emanating on what were then the far peripheries of the British Empire, notably in New Zealand and Australia, but also Canada and India. Similarly, John Wilson, which is the book in the centre here, John Wilson has shown that the British civil service system, often referred to as a marker of British modern administrative advancement, originated not in Britain or by Britons, but in the British administration in Calcutta, which was run by Bengalis and British together, predominantly by Bengalis. It appears that the invention of the civil service system, which occurred in Bengal, and examinations there may have been influenced by the significant interaction between that part of the world and the Qing dynasty of that time. So this is all part of a new wave of global history writing, which narrates what Moyne and Sartori call the building of the global, meaning the modern global, in a new way, removing the centrifugal force, centre-periphery outward flow ideology inherited from imperial and civilizational history, and instead showing, and again, showing through source research, not just putting forward the opinion that they don't like it, but showing historically how that is not what actually happened. In addition to this wave of influential history writing simply negating centrism in early modern and modern history by presenting the facts, there have also been a wide array of theoretical alternatives suggested. S.N. Eisenstadt's idea of multiple modernities, Subramanian's idea of conjectural history, and also his idea of connected history, Sebastian Conrad's idea of integration, the first two of these allow for conjunction, thus things happening in different places to be studied, not requiring a cause and effect paradigm. As Subramanian pithily puts it, this approach refuses to see historical change acting like a virus, as he puts it, but rather points to deeper underlying factors which may cause similar things to happen in different places. This opens up a whole range of possibilities for global history. If I can just see we're getting a bit abstract, one solid example related to Confucianism, urbanization. Urbanization and how urbanization affects literacy, which enables engagement with Confucianism. Urbanization happened in the Ming and early Qing, and urbanization happened in Tokugawa, Japan. They weren't actually related to it. One did not cause the other, but they happened around the same time. And they both are very central to the development of Confucianism. Yeah. But one didn't cause the other. So Conrad's idea of integration, which he actually uses to define his own relatively narrow definition of global history, focuses on interaction and movement towards shared norms, but does not assume the centre-periphery and hierarchicalised vision of imperial and civilizational history of Eurocentrism. Conrad achieves that to a large extent through adopting more varied approaches to space and time. The spatial turn we referred to earlier, enabling analysis of interlinking connections along a range of different vectors. Intriguingly, given the Cambridge History of Confucianism's focus on East Asia and the influence of the new Cambridge History of Japan in my own approach to this topic, and also intriguingly, given that Watanabe Hiroshi sensei, Professor Watanabe Hiroshi, was the first person to give, was part of these lectures. Sanjay Subramanian, in his famous Daedalus article of 1998, outlining his approach to conjunctural history as an alternative to Eurocentrism, noted the particularly privileged position of Japanese history. And here's the quote, right? So first, he complains about Eisenstadt's approach, Eurocentric approach of the past. And then he says, this issue of Daedalus is evidence that such a view now appears untenable even to Eisenstadt. And yet, where are we to go from here? Clearly, the historians of Japan are at a considerable advantage in the sense that the Japanese historical tradition itself has long insisted on the singularity of Japanese modernization, deeply rooted in specific institutions, but still comparable in some sense to the received Western model. The bottom line, which makes this vision credible, is the Japanese bank balance. Many other parts of the world are not quite in the same position, but as Southeast Asia and even South Asia arrives in economic terms, one presumes a reconsideration of their historical trajectories too will eventually be seen as necessary. This is an unfortunate reason for historical revisionism, but there may be some point to facing up to it. So here, Subramanian both praises Japanese history as a model for a way to do history outside a Eurocentric mentality, but on the other hand also points to the potential duplicity and presentism that perhaps this is only possible because Japan is, or at least was at the time he was writing, a rich country. The fact that since China's so-called economic rise, China is similarly treated in this way at the moment, might for us be both a confirmation of Subramanian's concerns, but also a warning to be careful of other kinds of centrist thinking. Centricism, so let's now turn directly to centrism, the problem of centrism in the history of Confucianism. It's a problem for three particular reasons. So I'd like to outline three particular reasons where centrism is a problem for a history of Confucianism. Number one, Eurocentrism as an approach has always used Confucianism as part of the construction of ideas of Asian despotism, dehistoricizing Confucianism in rejecting it. The idea that Asia and Confucianism was used to create this idea of Asia had a timeless despotic past. This is problematic not only for the rejection of Asian history, which of course we've overcome that, nobody believes in Asian despotism anymore, but it is also problematic because it established a tradition of seeing Confucian history as timeless. And I think that is still a problem, especially for many adherents or proponents of Confucianism. That's the first problem. So Eurocentrism lives on through ideas like Asian values, I would say, right? Number two is, centrism as a way of thinking is also particularly problematic with Confucianism because, of course, Confucianism itself includes this way of thinking in something similar to the civilizational hierarchy paradigm. It's not the same as a Western civilizational paradigm, but it's something with some similarities to it. A hierarchicalization of civilizations inherent within the Confucian tradition. So the danger is that historians who stay too close to the sources, by which I mean historians who describe too much and don't analyse enough, they could easily begin to replicate this centrism which you can see within some Confucian texts. This centrism in the tradition could merge with the centrism in modern history writing. And then the third problem, this is particularly a problem, the third reason, because two modern countries in the Confucian area, China and Japan, have been or are both global great powers. They are nation states constructed more or less along the lines of the Western nation-state empires. They're constructed, the modern states of China and Japan are both constructed to replicate Britain, France, Germany, the United States, right? And in that sense, they're constructed to replicate that sort of Eurocentric, that sort of process that we see in the link between Eurocentrism and Western empire. So there's almost a structural inclination to adopt this way of thinking. So these are the three big problems. But as I said, more current historical methodology equips us with all kinds of alternatives to overcome these problems, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow when we actually talk about how the chapters in the volume use these approaches. So then this brings us then to number 3, critique of elite history and alternatives to it. So critique of elite or top-down history and alternatives to it, particularly the alternative of so-called history from below. I'll just drink a little bit of water. One of the most striking, so we're on to section number 4 here. Critiques of and alternatives to elite history. One of the most striking differences between the new Cambridge History of Japan, published this year, and the original Cambridge History of Japan, published between 1988 and 1998, is the strong representation of history from below in the new series. This presents through gender history, women's history, history of underclasses, urban history, history of colonised indigenous groups, frontier history, borderland history, protest history, all of which are well represented in each of the 3 volumes of the New Cambridge History of Japan. Now, in one sense, it's surprising that this is different to the old Cambridge History of Japan, because the old Cambridge History of Japan was conceived of was done in the 1970s, and history from below, the social history movement and social history below, had already begun in the 1960s. It's often associated with the British historian E.P. Thompson and his famous work, The History of the English Working Class. And these ideas of history from below were already well entrenched as the dominant element in US and UK history departments by the end of the 1970s. So it's kind of surprising that the 1988 to 1998 volumes did not have much of a social history emphasis. We might attribute this to the way the history of East Asia in general, and Japan in particular, was written in the West until the 1980s. Up until that time, the field still retained many aspects of Oriental studies, including an emphasis on the classic texts, philology, philosophy, and religion. This was all part and parcel of an Orientalist vision of Asian history, which was looking for civilizational values and markers, by their nature, timeless and potentially essential. From the 1980s, Japanese history in the English language became much more integrated with Japanese history writing in Japan. In Japanese, that is, right? Japanese history writing in Japan had enjoyed an emphasis on social history even predating the 1960s. And they also jumped onto the reforms that were seen after the likes of E.P. Thompson. Laura Hine, in her introduction to the New Cambridge History of Japan, points out the contemporary integration of American Japanese history writing with Japanese history writing as, for her, the major change in the field which occurred in the period between the 2 series. It's also important to note that while social history as a movement has a long history dating back from the mid-20th century, most of the subfields I mentioned above, which are heavily represented in the New Cambridge History of Japan, are much newer. So although women's history and histories of the colonised, underclass and Indigenous people, although those fields have been around for a long time, it was only really in the 1990s that they became standardised parts of history, that they were required in history teaching. And it's also in the 1990s, of course, that fields like environmental history, borderland and frontier history really took off, particularly in the United States. So as you'll see tomorrow, these genres are also well represented in the Cambridge History of Confucianism. However, I would suggest that having such approaches represented in the Cambridge History of Confucianism was a bit more challenging than having them represented in the Cambridge History of Japan. Why? Confucianism is often considered an elite tradition. Confucianism is often considered a male-dominated tradition. The history of Confucianism is intimately connected with literacy. Confucianism seeks to differentiate between so-called civilized and barbarian, separates men and women, high and low. Some might say that given this nature of Confucianism, it would be totally understandable and indeed rational for me as the editor and for the authors of the chapters not to be influenced in any way by history from below or the subgenres and methodologies associated with it. I think it would not be acceptable. And I would like to use a methodological example, historical anthropology, and historical anthropology is very closely related with the rise of social history. I'd like to use a historical anthropology example to explain why I don't think it's acceptable to leave the history of Confucianism as elite history. Anthropology and historical anthropology as method has facilitated many of the subgenres of history that we just mentioned. And there are a whole range of reasons for that, why anthropology facilitated these different kinds of histories. But the most important reason, the single most important reason, is that historical anthropology gives us methods for telling the stories of historical actors who did not keep written records, who did not write. Marshall Sahlon's Islands of History, down in the bottom right-hand corner here, is indicative of a wave of writing from the 1980s in particular, which rewrote Indigenous people into the histories of countries in the Pacific Rim by employing non-written sources, non-textual sources, alongside critical readings of imperial sources. This kind of history writing, where anthropology and archaeology, but particularly anthropology, is used alongside written sources, has totally changed the narrative of, for example, the frontier wars, which heralded the colonisation of the American West, the frontier wars which colonised Australia and the Pacific. In other words, it has totally transformed the narrative through which the histories of Australia, New Zealand, the west coast of the United States of America, and the west coast provinces of Canada are told. It has also transformed and significantly deepened understandings of the histories of Fiji, Vanuatu, Hawaii, Samoa, and the Cook Islands. And this new history has also had very significant social and political effects. And this is this newspaper article here. For instance, the High Court of Australia, which is Australia's Supreme Court, ruled in 1992 in the case Mabo versus the State of Queensland. In that ruling, it recognised for the first time the land property rights of Australian Aborigines. The first time land property rights of Australian Aborigines had ever been acknowledged in Australian or British legal history. And this judgment was based primarily on historical anthropological evidence. It was a legal judgment based on non-written historical sources through anthropological methodological intervention. This ruling not only embodied a major symbolic change in relations between Indigenous Australians and the state, it had real legal ramifications on land ownership worth billions of dollars. The Prime Minister of Australia at that time, Paul Keating, said of the ruling that it, quote, establishes a fundamental truth and lays the basis for justice. If the full bench of judges of the High Court of Australia, lawyers, if they can use historical anthropology to decide a case central to national identity and affect the ownership of billions of dollars of property, it seems rather unconscionable for professional historians not to be trying to use this methodology. If in approaching Confucianism, we simply said, well, seeing literary culture is central to Confucianism, we just won't bother with any non-literary sources or people who are not literate, wouldn't that be the same as saying that, well, seeing our legal system is based on written laws, we will assume anyone without written records never existed, has no property rights and no other human rights? There's a sort of parallel here, I think, right? So if a history of Confucianism is to actually say something about the political and social impact of Confucianism, of its operation and effect, then we must engage it like any other history. If we think illiterate people are also people, then when we do history, particularly the history of sociological systems like Confucianism, like English law, which privilege elite written culture, then surely we are beholden to use methodologies which tell the whole truth, the fundamental truth of the impact of these systems. Again, here I'm identifying a problem, or we can identify a problem, but we also have, and we have had for over 40 years, alternative methods, ways of getting around this problem. So the problems associated with elite history, for instance, excluding large groups of people who are actually affected by that history, excluding them from the narrative, this can be addressed through recent methodologies which allow us to broaden the lens of historical research and writing. And tomorrow, you'll see some examples. You'll see some very good examples from the Cambridge, well, I think they're good, from the Cambridge History of Confucianism. So this then brings us to the last, this is the sort of area affected by that anthropological turn in terms of law. And then this brings us to the last part of the talk, which is the issue of period. This brings us to the question of period and periodization. I'll just drink some water again, sorry. The history of Confucianism is, of course, by definition, a longue durée history. The return of longue durée history has been a part of the turn to global history seen over the past 20 years. This has been both remarked upon by scholars like Sebastian Conrad, but also advocated by scholars like Joe Gouldy and David Armitage in their very influential History Manifesto, which is this book here, which is I won't comment on the book, but it's an interesting book. Among the many arguments given to promote longue durée history in Gouldy and Armitage's History Manifesto, the first relates to the need for historical writing to have social and political influence. Gouldy and Armitage argue convincingly that the tendency towards short-term, short-time scale in academic history writing through the latter 20th century, and in the latter 20th century, most PhD theses and books focused on just a few years in the discipline of history. This made academic history's lens too narrow to cast a light on big social issues, they argue. They argue that is a major reason why the previous social and political influence that historians enjoyed has passed almost totally to social scientists in the late 20th century. Gouldy and Armitage are keen to point out that this is partly the historian's own fault. It's their own choice for framing things too small to have an impact. They encourage historians to do big, longue durée projects that can show long-term trends and underlying patterns in human society, to correct the short-termism and, as they would see it, fake scientism of many social sciences approaches. My apologies to all the lovely social scientists in the room. So I've just been praising anthropology for long enough, so I think we all know that I have nothing against the social sciences. Certainly if we look at writing on Confucianism, at least in English, it appears to prove Armitage and Gouldy's theory correct. Over the past 15 years, a whole range of very popular books and theories have emerged in the social sciences, especially from international relations scholars, about the influence of Confucianism and Confucian paradigms in interstate relations in the past and in the present. Books by David Kang and Wang Yimin that you see here, these are good examples in English. These books are comprised mainly of historical narrative, but they're not written by historians. And they often make a range of historical mistakes or simplifications in their presentations. However, they dominate the field, simply because most professional historians' work is too narrow to be even slightly accessible, even to most other scholars, never mind any audience beyond that. Longue durée history is thus possibly a necessity if historical research is going to be returned to a position of influence in our society, say Gouldy and Armitage. Some of the other, and you see a connection here with their ideas and ideas of Lord Acton 130 years ago, which is interesting. Some of the other reasons advocated for longue durée history resonate with issues already discussed today. Longue durée history makes national history untenable. It demands longer-term categories like space and time, geography and social processes. Longue durée also usually makes keeping one centre, be it Eurocentric or Sinocentric or anything else centric, impossible, because the centre always changes in real history. it would be as ridiculous to claim Europe as the centre of the world in the 13th century as it would be to claim China or Japan as the centre of the world in the 19th century. If the duration of your study is long enough, your problems will be solved. Your problems of centrism and nationalism will be solved. If longue durée history is long enough, that is, if it reaches beyond recorded history, if the longue durée history reaches beyond the period covered by written records, then of course it also must use archaeological and anthropological methods, not just textual methods, which at the very least relativizes elite history and the issues of ignoring the illiterate majority. Longue durée, however, also requires some kind of logic or periodization to make sense. For the Cambridge History of Confucianism, I have tried to suggest flexible frames of period which emanate from the history of Confucianism itself, but which also, following the Cambridge history tradition, emphasise political universal history and resonate with traditional periodization markers. So I would say this periodization is both radical and deeply conservative at the same time. Now, I explained the plan for the periodization to Cambridge University Press using the conservative aspect. Right? That's how I explained to them. And allow me to quote from the proposal how I explained this periodization you see here. This is how I explained it to them. This 350,000 word volume is presented in 5 parts, each demarcated in terms of period. Part 1, covering prehistory to 300 CE. Part 2, from 300 to 900. Part 3, from 900 to 1400. Part 4, from 1400 to 1850. Part 5, from 1850 to 2020. Each part is made up of between 6 and 9 chapters, resulting in a total of 39 chapters of various lengths. Although not labelled in such terms, I told the press, the chronology of the 5 parts conforms to a very rough articulation of 1. Ancient, 2. Early medieval, 3. High medieval, early modern, 4. High early modern, and 5. Modern and contemporary history. These terms are not articulated in the book because their usage for East Asian history, particularly in relation to China, is highly contested. Presenting the parts through this kind of chronology, however, reminiscent as it is of broader periodic labels, should make the layout relatively accessible for global historians and other scholars not necessarily specialists in East Asia. Each of these chronologically delineated parts is made up of thematically arranged chapters. There are certain themes which return as parallel chapters in each of the different chronological parts of the volume. Notably, each part contains 2 chapters on Confucianism's transcultural, interstate, or international functions. Most of the other chapters in each part are thematic and not geographically limited. Authors writing these thematic chapters will be encouraged to stretch as much as possible beyond single states in their analysis. This means that the majority of chapters in each part will touch on Confucianism in more than one socio-political and/or cultural environment. That's how I explained it to the syndicate of the press. In reality, there is also an internal logic to this periodization, not motivated by normative practice or accessibility, but rather by a hypothesis on the longue durée significance of Confucianism for the history of East Asia and indeed for global history. This becomes clear if we look at the working titles of each of the chronological parts. Part 1, the pre-imperial and imperial roots of Confucianism. Part 2, Confucianism's cultural and geographical spread across the non-Han and post-Han states of East Asia. Part 3, Confucianism, culture, and identity in multi-state and multicultural East Asia. Part 4, Confucianism and early modernity. Part 5, Confucianism in modernity. This periodization is mainly informed by the geographic spread of Confucianism, by space in this first instance. And in the second instance, in parts 4 and 5, by the hypothesis that modernity, and possibly also early modernity, inescapably shape the contours of Confucianism in the same way that, according to major scholars of world religions and also major political philosophers like Habermas and Charles Taylor, the same way that early modernity and modernity shaped Christianity, Islam, and the political thoughts and political worlds around them. Now, of course, I do not impose this hypothesis or this reading on the authors. And in fact, I can tell you that many of the authors clearly have a very different view. But it's a frame. It's a frame. Periodization is, of course, a choice made by historians. A choice which makes points. When Naito Konan chose to call the Sung in I think about 1912 or maybe the early 1920s, when Naito Konan chose to call the Sung dynasty modern, you know, this famous historiographical act where the Japanese historian Naito Konan labelled the Sung dynasty as modern or early modern, he was not only making an insightful observation of particular aspects of commercial, political, and intellectual life in the Sung, in Sung China, he was also suggesting, A, that modernity could occur differently in different places, B, that modernity need not originate in the West, and C, that modern development did not go hand in hand with military superiority, because of course the Sung dynasty was militarily weak, right? So periodization is both an intellectual and political judgment. And I think it's important to remember that when Naito Konan made this analysis, all those points were new. This is the early 20th century, right? All these points were new. As we saw earlier, even the premise that modernity could occur in a different location or culture not under European influence is still not widely accepted, especially among scholars of modernity itself. The location of modernity or early modernity in a society which was militarily inferior, dominated by another, was also novel and is novel today. The comments were particularly pointed if we consider the historical context in which they were made. In the 1920s, for instance, when many Japanese, Europeans and Americans questioned the capacity of China to sustain itself as a country, partly due to its military weakness. And often this was linked to historical theories which argued China was inherently incapable of modernity. So by putting forward his theories, Naito Konan, he was punching back against those kinds of imperialistic ideas. The most controversial aspect of this periodization, the periodization that we're doing in the Cambridge History of Confucianism, the issue that most scholars would criticise us for here is perhaps our application of terms like modern and early modern, as well as medieval, a term which, although is not used, I think is sort of implied, even though it's not used. A further justification I would give for using these terms, and perhaps the main reason I personally use them, is that again they assist breaking down national history paradigms, and particularly paradigms of centrism and elitism. Think of the early modern example in particular. We have already touched on Naito Konan's use of the early modern paradigm for historicising the Sung and the political implications of that. When we talk about the early modern for the 1400 to 1850 period, we are immediately empowered to look at not only the ideas, but also the sociology and politics of a range of different states in East Asia in parallel. When we begin to identify changes in Confucian thought and in the sociology of Confucian practice and political influence related to early modernity, instead of simply calling them late imperial or Ming or Tokugawa, if we use this paradigm, then we're empowered to put these together and to use paradigms beyond state identity. The parameters that define early modernity, increasing finance, literacy, urbanization, and certain political changes, Koselleck's, you see the book here by Koselleck, Koselleck's idea of the horizons of expectation. This is this idea that in the early modern period, a change in political consciousness occurs due to these socioeconomic changes where people begin to look for a sort of better horizon, right? We can begin to use approaches like that, interact with ideas like that, and also economic changes. And you see here these books by Hayami Akira. Hayami Akira's idea of the industrious revolution. This is another idea that originally comes from Japanese history writing, but has been used also to write the history of a lot of European countries, which is the idea that before the Industrial Revolution, and I think it's been pretty much proved through the sources that before the Industrial Revolution, within agricultural economies, there was already this change in social organisation, which Hayami Akira labelled the Industrious Revolution, which created all these socioeconomic and also intellectual changes. So we can begin to use those kinds of paradigm, and this also challenges centrism because these parameters change over time and happen in different places at the same time. In 1450, the Ming, of course, probably had the biggest urban centres in the world in the 1450, but in 1700 that was probably Edo. So by global standards, both of those societies were remarkable for their levels of urbanisation, and in both those societies, Confucianism played a major role. To choose a historical lens which does not allow us to compare those, to compare, say, Suzhou and Edo, seems to me absurd. And the Japan-China lens favoured by Professor Watanabe in proposing this year's series, I think, is particularly pertinent here. And I thought I'd end this talk talking about sort of Japan and China just to bring it back to the theme that Professor Watanabe Hiroshi chose for last year's lecture series here at Zhengda. So I think I'll end my comments there and open the floor to reactions and comments and discussion and critique, if that's okay.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Professor and Paramore, for such a thought-provoking, inspiring, and sometimes eye-opening and entertaining as well. A very wonderful lecture. And we have 30 minutes for Q&A session. So I'm sure you've got lots of comments or questions to raise. So shall we begin? So it's time open to the floor. Any questions? And I'm sure, apart from those people mentioned by Professor Paramore, I can see Eric Hobsbawm and Mishra and Duara smiling in the background. And Hegel, the great philosopher, is on the defensive. I can see that. Wonderful. And questions from the floor? Professor John?
First, I want to thank Professor Paramore for delivering such a, indeed, as Professor Ye said, eye-opening and very mind-blowing, in a way, views, because the methodological perspective you introduced today is very much unheard in Sino, including Taiwanese historical fields, as far as I know. So I think it's very rewarding, but I hope it will be also. I hope other students from historical department will also find it rewarding. But well, I would like to contribute something more constructive to your talk, but I think I want to contribute something more sincere, which is what I'm thinking about this issue. Because I think the problem of talking about the kind of this new history, as you described, in East Asia, particularly in the Sinophone world, there is a problem that is the Chinese. I mean, Chinese in the cultural sense. The Chinese, they cannot give up the essentialism because they identify themselves as Chinese versus the West, the Westerners. So for them, identity is something very important. But the methodology you introduced is to deconstruct the identity. So in your global history, it is not only decentralized, it is also deconstructing identities. There's no identity, isn't it? So that is the problem. So I think this methodology would be more welcomed to those who doesn't need a traditional identity than for those, in particular for the Chinese, to accept it, because they need identity to identify themselves, to situate themselves in this global world. So that is my worry.
Good. You are talking about the kind of people like me. I don't have this sort of identity. Shall we take one more question before Professor Paramore begin to answer? Yeah.
Hi, I'm from Tallinn University in Estonia, and I guess my question is quite connected to yours, which was also political objections to trying out this theory, which I imagine when a state is building an identity for its people, they might not want that kind of histories. So how should historians deal with those kinds of objections? Thank you.
All right. We've got two questions regarding how to rescue history from nationalism, or the other way around. Okay.
Should I say something?
Yeah, sure. Yes.
It is working? Oh, it's working now. Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for those questions. They're questions I worry about a lot. They're good questions. Thank you very much. Can I answer the second question first? I've been to Tallinn, to a European Association of Japanese Studies conference. Very nice. So we went to Tallinn University many years ago. But you know, you said, how do you deal with objections from states trying to create national identities? And the simple answer is facts. You know, this is why did I say that silly line where I said, I don't say we should talk about women in history because I love women. I think we should say it because it's a fact that women were there. And it sounds like a very trite statement that I made, but it's very important that it's based on the facts. So you and I are citizens of the European Union, right? And we're living in a time when there's a war, right? And where indeed the states are telling us what we should think, along with various media organizations and so forth. So we are very much, well, you're here, but I'm over there, right? We're very much part of this of course it's still going on, right? We still live in a world of nation states. We still live in a world of nation states, and it's not just China. And if you spend some time in Europe in the last 18 months, you can see it's definitely not just China, right? This sort of creation of nation-state identity and those paradigms, of course they're still happening. Of course they're still happening. But those things have been deconstructed and understood now since at least the 1960s. We understand how those processes work. And we have historians like Prasenjit Duara who have used the history of East Asia to really contribute to understandings more broadly of how those systems of nations creating identities and imposing on them on people, how they work. Benedict Anderson, Benedict's famous work from the 1980s, another scholar of Asian studies, right, an Indonesia specialist, who then used that history to explain how that system works. So if we're scholars, we know how that system works. We have the tools, right, to deconstruct and understand how that works. But of course, your point is correct, both of you. The nation states will continue to, carry out this program. And as we see, as citizens in Europe, it might have appeared that those processes were decreasing. It only takes a couple of months to ramp it back up to the full sort of xenophobic wartime setting, right? So these things can go back and forth very quickly. When I first used to go to Japan, everybody's pacifistic, nobody mentions anything about nationalism, all this, that changed too, right? So these things change up and down. And thank God we are scholars, we are not politicians, right? So we don't have to do this. All we have to do is just do the work. Does that answer the question? About how to... We just do the work and employ the paradigms and use the paradigms. Then just to come back to the question of, well, what about the particular example of Chinese people wanting to use national identity? Like I said, there's people everywhere who want to use national identity. In Europe, look at the rise of the extreme right in Europe. I mean, unbelievable, right? I mean, in European countries, the really nasty sort of neo-Nazi type thing, very, very dominant across most of the countries of Europe. So this is not, this wish to use, to cling to these sort of national identities, to choose that as an overarching identity. This is happening everywhere. But, as Professor Ye said, different people can choose their identities. And of course, there's multiple identities. Only the modern construction of national identity assumes singular identities. In pre-modern societies, people always had multiple identities. One of the first most famous Japanese Confucians, Hayashi Razan, in one location he'd present himself as a Buddhist priest. In another location he'd present himself as if he was a Ming Dynasty Confucian. In another location he'd present himself as a samurai and swing his sword around, It depended what he was doing that day, right? And so we know that in a historical reality of pre-modern, by which I mean societies that are not controlled by modern nation states, we know in that reality people have multiple identities and had multiple identities. We know that human beings, and again anthropology, we know from anthropological research, we know from historical research that human beings normally have and engage multiple identities at the same time. So the demand that is made in high modernity that we restrict ourselves to a single identity, be that Chinese or be that I work for Mitsubishi, whatever the identity is, whatever the identity is, that is a modern phenomenon that has been deconstructed and understood. And deconstructing it, I agree, it doesn't make it go away. It doesn't stop people from working that way. But what we can do is just keep presenting, looking into the facts and pushing forward the science, I would say. To make that answer.
Yeah, of course. A few decades ago, a British historian of international relations, Taipei, coined a phrase called the return of medievalism, and that means everyone has a set of identities, many different identities in the medieval period. So why do we have to single out a particular one and attach to that so essentially? Okay. Any more questions? Okay. Okay. Professor Lim?
我想我用中文问，然后也许比较清楚。那如果那个不然我教授不清楚啊，请那个叶老师帮我这个翻译一下。那我想那个Paramore 教授这一个主题就是说，希望对于这个历史的理解，从用全球史的角度来理解。换句话是说呢，不从民主或国家这个角度来进行这个理解。那因此呢，我们对历史的理解就可以去除一种精英主义，一种汉族中心主义的这种观点，而能够从底层的生活来加以这个解释。可是如果这样的一种观点成立的话，我觉得有2个问题可能需要解释。第一个，如果历史能够进步的话，它通常预设有一些价值的选择，或者一种价值的整合，使得这一种比如说像儒家这样一种所谓的这样一种思想，能够从中国一直传播到这个亚洲各国，或者从古代到现在不断发展。所以这样的一种理念或价值的这种选择，事实上如果排除精英，排除某一些这个经典的这种文化基础的话，很难去想象。那第二个部分就是说，如果我们要从这个底层的生活来加以这个解释的话，那我不但能够了解说，那这种底层的这个生活如何能够产生一种所谓的这个价值的这种这个吸引力或价值的这种整合的这种基础，以至于能够推动一种历史的一种有益的这种进步，从而可以来看待历史。这2个问题。
And value, a set of values. Yeah, and the first question is about and the progress of history is all about people reading a particular set of canonical texts and learning a lot from a small group of elites. And if you give up those 2 elements and adopt your view, then how could we make progress in history? Focus on texts.
What does progress mean?
And the second question, answer your curiosity. The progress means a set of values winning in the free market of ideas, and that means confusion. Would that be all right for you? 林老师认为的进步的内容是什么？
就是说，历史的发展一定是有某种理念的改变。对，就是比如说，我觉得他提出一些对人性的，而且也许是一些认为有价值，至于亚洲的很多国家会认同这个价值，而接受这个儒家的这个发展。
All right, all right. Exactly what I thought. Confucianism symbolizes a set of values so valuable for the whole humankind, and embracing that would mean a progress in history. Would you? It's a difficult question.
I think the values change over time and in place. So, for instance, say the role of family, for instance, those family structures change over time and place.
Sorry.
I think the question of values is that values change over time and values change in terms of place. So say the value of the social unit of the family, that is, you can say, okay, through Confucianism, the clan or family unit, this is a major part of ideas within Confucianism, both ideas and also practices. Practices, the ja, or the ie in Japanese. This is an important thing. But the nature of families, the nature of, for instance, the role of women in China, in Han Chinese families. This changes through history. Right? The Japanese, Watanabe Hiroshi sensei would say, well, everybody would say, the Japanese idea of ie, that ja is ethnographically different from other forms of ja, other forms of family. Of course, within what is now China, of course, there are many different cultures which have different family structures. To give you an example from outside East Asian history, in Emmanuel Todd, the French demographer, he has a whole theory of explaining differences in French politics related to different family structures within France. France is a small place by comparison with East Asia. It's a small place. So I always have trouble with this question because I would not deny that there are values in Confucianism. But once you've named those values, once you look at their historical manifestations, they're different. So you could say, yes, the role of the family or clan is central in Confucian practice and in Confucian political thought also. But what that means is different in different parts of East Asia and in different time periods. Does that make sense?
Yeah, let me paraphrase the question a little bit. Do you believe in any perennial question and eternal answers? Or simply no eternal answers, but we do have some perennial questions, but different cultures respond in different ways?
I would not take the approach that different cultures respond in different ways, because the assembly of cultures is in continual change. You know, here we are in Taiwan. Taiwan was a Dutch colony. It imported Fujianese labor. The Qing took over. It became a colony of the Japanese Empire. All through this period, different Aborigines lived here. You all know this, right? So the assembly of what the culture is continually under change. Australia, where I'm from, when I grew up in Australia, is predominantly Anglo-Irish people, right, with some Mediterranean people. That completely changes just in my lifetime. I'm only 50 years old. The whole nature of society, of the Minzu, like the idea of thinking of folk, you know, the folk idea, for someone like, it's very difficult to take the idea of folk seriously, because the change in a place like Taiwan or in a place like Australia or a place like Ireland, where I live now, the change in the anthropological makeup of society, even in one lifetime, even in my lifetime, is so massive. And that's always been the case. You know, even in pre-modern societies, the makeup of the ethnic makeup of places would change very, very quickly. So I'm not saying there's not values and that they're not related to societies. They are related to societies, but those societies are constantly changing. So therefore the values, the meaning of the value, say family, the meaning of what does the family value means, that is constantly changing through history, I would say. And I think, and that doesn't mean I don't believe anything. I'm not saying I don't believe anything, but I think you've got to move with the reality of the moving society. So you need to think of values that move together with society, if that makes sense. So linking a value to a folk, doesn't strike me as very useful, because the composition of a folk is changing so quickly and always has been changing so quickly.
I'm satisfied, very logically consistent. Any more questions? Okay, one more, and maybe we.
Hello, Professor Palmer, and my question is that when we talk about global history, we are usually connected by transnationalism. With the development of nowadays Chinese nationalism, regarding the history of overseas Chinese and the multicultural exchange, do you think that Confucianism is a kind of expression of transnational nationalism in the 18th to 21st century to restrict the history of global history? Thank you.
If we have any more questions, I can take one more. Okay. And then to finish the session. Okay.
Oh, so my question is actually quite simple. Basically, my question is about the use of history, and we know that nationalist state will use elite history or this kind of method, kind of spread propaganda or kind of shape reality. So I think this the professor that the method that you propose will make these kind of action harder to do, but how this kind of history through historical anthropology, this kind of history could be used by I don't know, ordinary people or scholars or activism, how we could use this kind of history to change society or to do something more concrete. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
All right, we've got two questions, and that'll be the end.
Okay, thank you for that last question. I'll take the last question first and then the other question. That's why I took the time to talk about that Mabo High Court judgment. You know, billions of dollars, but also total change to national identity for white Australians. But what about the Indigenous Australians? For them, you know, totally different situation. So this stuff does have impact. It is having impact. I don't think, you know, some people think, oh, historians should engage the community and so forth, you know. And hey, if people want to do that, that's fine too. But for instance, those High Court judges, they made that judgment based on expert witnesses explaining to them using anthropology to explain that this land was definitely owned by these clans, these families, you know, and how that was done. So our job, I think, as scholars is just to develop the science, to develop the analysis and to offer it up. And there'll be moments in history, not always. Sometimes you've got bad moments of history, like maybe at the moment. But sometimes there'll be good moments of history where High Court judges or politicians or other people will pick that up and run with it. So that would be the answer to that question. Then in relation to the use of Confucianism in a sort of exclusivist Chinese nationalism or something like that, I guess, and talking about the diaspora, you know, my personal view is I don't think the use of the Chinese government, you know, Chinese national ideology, you know, the mainland Chinese national ideology use of history, I think it might make sense domestically to some degree, but it doesn't make much sense in terms of where the real Chinese diaspora is in places like Southeast Asia and Australia and Canada and the United States. Because you look at what is the most anti-Chinese country in international relations, it's the country I'm from, Australia. The foreign minister's name is Wang. You know, that's her name. You know, Penny Wong is the foreign minister advancing one of the most anti-Chinese foreign policies there is. So, and there's many, many, many other examples. So I think the vision of sort of trying to control the diaspora, the so-called Chinese diaspora, through this sort of exclusivist national history paradigm, I think the evidence is that it's not very effective. Yeah. So if I was to advise the Chinese government, if I was an advisor to the Chinese Communist Party, I would say, I would maybe try to say that maybe they can achieve their aims through other means. Yeah. Similarly, as if I was an advisor to some of the European Union governments, you know, especially the government of Germany, I would say maybe this kind of nationalism is not what's going to help you develop the kind of Europe you want. You know. Yeah.
I think once upon a time when we talk about modernism, sovereign state and democracy and even transitional justice, we look to the West, either Europe or United States. and seeing their practices as models we have to adopt. So gradually, we East Asian people become copycat already. And now, Professor Paramore would like to change our attitude. But I think changing the attitude of a copycat is much more difficult than changing the attitude of the originator. But anyway, we've got a lot to say and to talk about.
But again, I don't think, and this is where Benedict Anderson's work come in, the modern nation state is not an invention of the West. Again, the modern nation, so that is again part of this paradigm, part of this fiction that these paradigms have come from the West and moved out to the rest of the world. That's not true. So if you think of where liberalism, where a lot of British identities come from, they're formed in relation to what was happening in India, what was happening in Australia, right? Modern ideas in Europe are informed by that colonial history. So there's an interaction, I think, yeah.
Very good reminder. And I'm sure Professor Paramore has a lot to talk about tomorrow morning. So do come to the next session. Okay, see you tomorrow.